Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see you all here. I see a bunch of old friends in the audience. I'm David Leonhardt with the New York Times, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation about something that is really so important to all of us. I am joined, of course, by Mari McInnes, the president of Yale University, and by Brett Zabar, managing director who oversees life sciences at General Atlantic. And we're going to talk about the role of higher education and research and the government and the private sector in fostering both health and national prosperity. And we're going to get into lots of really important policy issues, but I actually want to start with a story because it tends to be how human beings learn and think, and a story that really is going to help highlight what exactly that we're talking about today. And with that, I'll turn it over to President McInnes.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our panel. So I thought it would be useful to start with a story that helps us understand how America got to its approach about this partnership that has brought together government funding, research at American universities, and the private sector. And so I'm going to dial us back to World War II, and actually even a little before World War II, when in 1928, a Scotsman made a discovery of a mold, a fungus, that killed lots of different bacteria. And he understood that there had to be a medical benefit to that. If we could figure out how to fight bacteria, we could save so many people from dying. Research continued at Oxford University, and they were struggling with figuring out how to produce in quantity this fungus that we all know as penicillin. And it turned out that there was a researcher at Yale University who figured out how we could begin to produce penicillin at scale, began what we might think of now as clinical trials by dosing a patient who was very ill at Yale New Haven Hospital, saved this woman's life, and started experimenting with it as well as figuring out how to produce it at scale. But by now we're in the middle of World War II. We're losing many soldiers to death by infection from their injuries in World War II. And they figure out how to produce enough of this at scale so that by the time we get to D-Day, there is enough to treat every soldier in the Allies as part of the D-Day invasion. But it had been not just this Yale researcher, it was funded by the US government, and it was Merck and Pfizer who helped produce it at scale. And so what we learned, what the US government and American society learned from things like that happened during World War II was the amazing power of what could be accomplished if you put government money with the best scientists in America, with private companies to figure out how to do things at scale. And it was after World War II that America decided to make this massive commitment of funding to continue sponsoring research, but to do so, instead of by building a bunch of different institutes, funding US universities. And so that is really how this partnership began.
And that's a charming bit of history, and it's not a story, that ends 80 years ago, right?
No,
we
absolutely.
all have lived through, just in the last few years, a repeat of that story.
Yeah, so I would say the repeat of that story, one of the best examples is Operation Warp Speed. It normally takes us about a decade to bring a vaccine to market. And yet, because we had been doing mRNA research at universities for a couple of decades, having no idea where it was going to lead us, the scientists who began their work on mRNA were just curious about the role of mRNA. But by the time we got to needing a COVID vaccine, it had already been speculated that this could be a good vector for vaccines. And so enters the US government with $18 billion in funding to think about how we're going to make this happen quickly. And in under a year, building on decades of university research, working with multiple companies, we brought a vaccine to the American public in a year.
And we're here to talk about health, obviously, and we're going to talk about health. But I just want to spend a minute to broaden this story out, right? You talk about this kind of tripartite relationship, and Dr. Zabar is going to talk to us in a minute specifically about the private sector, where we've got the government, our best scientists, higher education, and the private sector. And so that has transformed health, but it's also transformed most of the most important industries in our society. So that same three-part relationship is what helped create the semiconductor. It's what helped create the modern aviation industry. It's what helped create satellites. It is what literally built the internet. The Defense Department built the original network of connected computers. We all, not just the president, we all have ties to Yale. And so I'm going to mention a Yale person here. Grace Hopper, for whom one of the residential colleges at Yale is named, embodies this wonderful story. She was a pioneering political scientist, computer scientist during World War II and after. She was part of the Navy. She worked in higher education, and then she worked in the private sector, and she was one of those people who did exactly this, which is she helped use government money with the best researchers and then got it out into the private sector and made possible the internet that we have today. And so, Dr. Zabar, what I want to ask you is, why do we need the private sector? And I'm phrasing that like in a little bit of an edgy way, but I don't doubt that we do need the private sector. But I want to understand, why is it just not enough to have government and universities doing this off to the side? Why do we need the capital markets and the kind of glorious energy of capitalism to come in and make this all work better?
Thanks, David. Well, I'm actually going to start with something that's happened almost directly in between World War II and the vaccine that you mentioned, which is the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, which was really transformative and in many ways kind of the foundation of the biotechnology industry. And I'm sure as many people in the audience know, the Bayh-Dole Act was really what allowed universities and other not-for-profit entities to own the intellectual property coming out of research funded by the federal government. And that act and that legislation, which allowed this ownership, enabled those entities to license that intellectual property to a totally new category of companies, basically the biotechnology industry, which really couldn't exist otherwise. And starting in the mid-1980s all the way up through the last 40-plus years. And so the private sector really has come in after a lot of the foundational biology work has been done, understanding what are the right biological targets to go after some degree, hopefully, of biological validation. A lot of the work that, to your point, Mari, that may not lead anywhere. But it's so expensive to develop new medicines from that point when we identify where does the biology make sense, where could intervening potentially yield a new medicine, that we really need the capital of the private sector to bring those forward. The cost of developing a new medicine today, according to the recent Tufts research that's been done, is on average more than $2 billion because of the enormous amount of failure that occurs in this industry. And failure is really the right description. I mean, if you look at the molecules that enter human clinical trials, and many of those molecules enter human clinical trials every year, fewer than 10% actually become new medicines. Even if you look at those new medicines that enter the most expensive later stages of development, phase 3 trials, only about half of those become new medicines. So you really need the engines of the capital markets, the US capital markets in particular, and I'll come back to that in a second, to fund that kind of research at the scale at which we fund it. The reason I mention the US capital markets in particular, we've been trying for a long time to develop more robust capital markets in other geographies, Europe in particular. We've tried in the Swiss exchange, we've tried in the United Kingdom. There really hasn't been a region that's been able to replicate the robustness of the United States capital markets when it comes to public and private financing of the biotechnology industry.
That's really interesting. So you think about both the unique American strength of our markets, but also the fact that we've had a government that wants to be quite energetic about financing this.
Yeah. And I would add another feature that I think has been unique to America's approach to this. Many European nations, in their funding for research, set up institutes, and they fund the institutes, and they hire scientists into the institutes. What we've done instead is fund money to the agencies, NIH and others, and then the scientists at our universities compete for grants. And that process of constant competition, in theory, should mean that the best and most forward-looking science is always getting funded, right? That competitive, constant reevaluation by your peers has been part of what has been so robust about innovation in America, and it's a different approach
and we're
from most European nations.
We're going to get to some of the weaknesses and imperfections in the system, but I do think it's important to kind of just make clear its massive strengths, right? And in terms of, there's a flip version of the question that I just asked you, which is, well, why do we need government and universities? Why can't this just happen through the R&D budgets of Eli Lilly or Google? And I want to give you my sense of what the answer to that is and see if it's consistent with yours, which is this basic research is so uncertain, so much of it is going to fail, as you were just talking about. It's also, even when it succeeds, you don't necessarily know where it's going to lead, right? And so if General Motors were to start to do some research that ended up being profitable in a place that doesn't help the car industry, it might not help them. And so you just don't get nearly enough R&D and basic science unless you have the government involved. Does that feel right?
It feels completely right to me. I mean, if you look at even what we're doing in large language models today, some of that rests on foundational science that was done 40 years ago, and nobody knew where that was going to lead. So you couldn't set out as a company and say, oh, I want to create AI or I want to create large language models 40 years ago and have it come to fruition 40 years later. And so many of our medical advances are coming out of research that's grown over decades before we figure out what it's useful for. And many drugs end up being useful not for the thing you started or thought you were creating it for, right?
Absolutely.
But, yeah.
And a lot of our industry is focused on translational medicine, meaning taking what we've learned in animal models and animal experiments and preclinical experiments and translating it into humans. But you need that foundational biology to translate. Without that foundation, we really can't do the work.
And it's not the mission of the companies that you're investing in their mission is to be good companies. Right? Their mission is not to think of all of society, right? Their mission is to be good companies and make good products. And so that's why I think we need others to think about the interests of all of society. Again, when you think broader than health, one of my favorite stories about this is that IBM early on was relatively uninterested in the promise of personal computers because they thought it might disrupt their punch card business. And they were right. The personal computer might have disrupted their punch card business because they were looking out for IBM's interest. Right. But the US government, and particularly the US military, said, hey, we need those computers in order to track Soviet planes potentially coming over from Alaska. And that is what gave IBM the big push to really get involved in it. And so then when we think about universities' particular role in this, they're sort of at the hinge of government and private companies. Yeah. Why do we need universities in this?
We need universities because we do more than just the research and innovation piece. So that's a piece of it, right? We have these environments in which scientists can come and be surrounded by generations of others. So part of what we're doing is educating future generations, but often for many of our scientists, part of their creativity is that they can build this team across generations who come to them with new ideas. They're surrounded by other colleagues, working in other places, who are bringing fresh ideas, right? And at a company that had a more narrow focus, you might not have those people in other disciplines that are kind of adjacent but not exactly aligned. And so it's just this perfect environment for discovery and innovation to take place. And we're helping to train the future leaders that will be necessary to go into both private sector work and other areas. And without the opportunity for our young scientists, both as undergraduate students and later as they enter their graduate training, to be part of that kind of cutting edge science, they wouldn't be ready to go off and lead in the private sector. So it just is this kind of perfect ecosystem that it would be hard to replicate outside of higher education.
And no other country has replicated it. I mean, you referred to the difficulty of finding markets that work as well as ours. I mean, is there any country in the world that has a biotechnology sector nearly as strong as ours? And what kind of comes after the United States?
Well, there certainly is great science happening in Europe, no question. But many of the European biotechnology companies, as they approach clinical testing and become successful, come to the United States for capital formation, are listed on United States exchanges. There's certainly a lot of activity in China, which is, I'm sure something we'll talk about a bit later. But the capital markets there, again, have been very cyclical in terms of their ability to finance these enterprises.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about some of the weaknesses with this marvelous system and the imperfections. So I think we've all, and particularly in recent months, sort of heard stories about inefficiencies in the system, right? With the idea of how much overhead might cost, or with the idea of how much bureaucracy there might be in the system. And from having talked to people inside of the system, actually they have many of those same frustrations. And so if I got to wave a magic wand and make you czar of all scientific and health research,
I'm not sure I'd do that to a historian, but okay.
what would you identify as the problems in this system, and what would you like to see changed? And you'll get your chance as czar next.
Yeah, I would say two primary things. The first kind of relates to something I was saying before, which is our process, which has our scientists competing through the agencies for funding for their future research, should ideally mean that we are always funding cutting-edge science. I would say the sense from many of our researchers is it has a tendency to fund iterations on things that are already proven, rather than taking the big bets. And so I think there is work for us to do to figure out how do we get back to a place where we really are funding people at early stage, high risk, potentially high reward, but could also fail. And we've got to get a little bit more of that attitude built back into our competitive process. The second thing I would say is we're a really, really regulated world within our agencies. The compliance burdens that have grown at American universities is now absorbing a huge amount of our costs, huge being in the 10 to 15% range, not the 75% range. But there is considerable money in indirect costs that could be saved if we just lowered our regulatory burden. And then I just feel obliged in my role, because I find this audience probably understands it well, but just in case anybody doesn't, the nomenclature around indirect costs is not fluff that universities are using to pad their coffers. They are direct research costs. They're just the ones that we calculate at the aggregate. The cost of your energy, the cost of building your buildings, the cost of paying your veterinarians in your animal resource center. I mean, the list goes on, but they are really shared research costs. They are not fluff for university coffers. They're real direct research costs.
I realize it's easy to wish for bipartisanship. It's easier to wish for it than to have it. But you mentioned the Bayh-Dole Act earlier. That's a bipartisan act. Bob Dole, a Kansas Republican, Evan Bayh, and or was it his dad, Birch Bayh, an Indiana Democrat. And this really, it seems to me, should be a bipartisan issue, right? The idea that we are over-regulating a sector, that should be naturally an issue for many conservatives and Republicans who tend to have a healthy skepticism of regulation. But given that many of the outcomes are things that Democrats and liberals very much value, it should also be interesting to them. It feels like it should be a way that we could kind of have some sort of consensus in this area.
Yeah, we absolutely should. And in fact, I think we're making some progress on that. When it was announced that indirects would be cut to 15%, and that hasn't happened yet, but it started a conversation around this topic. And America's leading research universities, which are all joined together in a group called the AAU, and America's sort of leading academic medical centers have put together a committee led by Kelvin Drogemeyer, and they've been in conversations about how do we help both lower indirect costs broadly and make it more transparent so that the public can understand how the American taxpayers' dollars are being spent. And I think we're making good ground in making progress there. So I'm hopeful that we'll get somewhere with that.
From your perch, what would you like to see changed in the system?
So I think your earlier point is right. We do want to acknowledge what are the areas that can be improved as a way of bringing as many people as possible together towards solutions. And I think part of that is acknowledging that not all of the research that gets federally funded today is necessarily what all of us in a perfect world would want to prioritize. And there are a number of many complicated reasons behind that. You alluded to a number of them, that the system in many ways tends to favor more incremental research. Sometimes that's because I think on the part of the grant applicants, that's the feeling of what a study section is most likely to approve. That's obviously not always the right answer. So I think there are structural elements that we can improve, including encouraging more of that risk-taking, but also making sure there's receptivity on the other side. Do we always have the best people that we would want on our study sections that are making these decisions? But also at a higher level, how are we thinking about strategic allocation of NIH and federal dollars towards the areas that will benefit most from funding? Ultimately, in many ways, these are congressional decisions in terms of which institutes get funded. But I don't think we've got really the right way of influencing kind of where those dollars go. Ultimately, we want to make sure that we're funding the biggest projects that have the best long-term potential of leading to actionable change in disease. And I think that's been something that's missing now for quite some time.
And can I add one thing that I think higher ed could be doing better? And I think we're starting to make these changes, but we have a ways to go. It typically takes about 17 years for a solution discovered in a lab to then make it into the public. And a lot of that slowness is actually on higher ed, right? Because we have a lot of scientists who are really excited with their curiosity-driven research. They're not doing the work quite often because they actually see the benefit of where it's going. Or if they do, they have no interest in getting it there, right? Because they're the lab-based scientist who loves the discovery. And so universities for a long time have not been very good at helping their faculty get things more quickly through development into commercialization. Many universities like Yale have begun to spin up things. We call ours Yale Ventures. We're really trying to help our faculty close that gap and support them in the work of what it takes to create their own companies or to find partners in the already established private sector to get those things to market. I would say a piece of that needs to be a bit of a mind shift in higher ed as well, where we are really celebrating and lifting up our faculty, not just for the discovery and the publication of their discoveries, but also for the impact that they have more broadly in the world. And that's a mind shift that I think higher ed needs to really focus on.
That makes sense.
I'll mention one more thing. When you look at some of the transformative models that have been developed over the last few decades for funding research federally, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute has been an enormous step forward. And these are grants that provide generally 7 years of funding to outstanding investigators without the same kind of annual checkpoints or compliance issues, and it's really been intended and I think in many ways delivered the kind of impact that you're describing. More recently, NIH had introduced the Outstanding Investigator Award, which is a similar idea. Those kinds of ideas, getting away from some of the most traditional ways we've thought about grant making, have enormous potential for impact.
Yeah. Well, eventually we're going to open up to all of you for questions. So if you have thoughts and questions, please keep them in mind. Before we do, I just want to spend a couple minutes on this political moment that we're living through, because how can we not? I talked a little bit about the fantastic successes of this three-part system that we have, and those are real. But I also think there's a way that many of them have not translated into the daily lives of most Americans, frankly. And so when you look at life expectancy in every rich country in the world, we're last by a lot. There is no other country that's close to us. And that is a relatively new phenomenon. In the 1980s, we still had a fairly normal life expectancy for a rich country. And then when you break that apart into life expectancy for people who have four-year college degrees and people who don't, the reason we've fallen behind is because life expectancy for people who lack a four-year college degree has stagnated. It is roughly where it was after COVID. It is roughly now where it was in the 1980s, which is really a shocking indictment of our society. And so when I think about the anger that so many Americans are feeling, some of it takes irrational and damaging forms. But I also think that in a basic way, despite the glories of this system we've talked about, it hasn't filtered down to many, many people's lives, particularly in health. How do you think about what we can be doing better as policymakers, as university leaders in the private markets to make sure that these breakthroughs we have actually help most Americans?
I would say that one of the real advantages of being at a university is that you have this amazing array of disciplines. And I think much of our problem there is we need to take a much more collaborative approach and a much more sort of systems approach, because it isn't just in the healthcare delivery. We know that healthcare delivery only accounts for about 20% of our outcomes. It is such a much more complicated issue. And at Yale, in the last decade or so, we've increasingly worked on larger multidisciplinary approaches to some of these problems. So a good example is the creation of an economics institute at Yale. It's called the Tobin Center, that's really focused on very practical applications. So a researcher called Zach Cooper was able to understand more fully the incredible costs around surprise medical bills. And through his research, led to policy changes. The legislation was called the No Surprises Act, and that's pulling like $35 billion a year out of the costs that people face. Not that that fixes everything, but more sort of examples of ways of bringing the disciplines together and thinking in a more systemic way. Our Dean of Public Health, Megan Rainey, who's sitting here in the front row, in her school is really leading conversations around understanding these problems and how we more quickly can move the ideas of action into real action. And so we have new tracks in our Masters of Public Health that are allowing for those kinds of solutions. We tend to get very siloed as we think about the delivery of healthcare, but we've really got to think much more broadly to the many underlying things that are leading to those discrepancies, because they start long before you encounter the healthcare system.
Yeah. And I know we have lots of people here who are involved in different ways and things. I would just encourage all of you, take a look at those life expectancy statistics, because if you ever wonder whether some of our national frustration is irrational, to me, the life expectancy statistics really tell you, no, people have a good reason to be frustrated with how our economy and society are delivering the goods for them. Okay, so there's a lot of talk in Washington. There's a bill in front of Congress. There are a whole bunch of executive policies as well. I'm interested in each of your thoughts about how could these policies affect some of the things we've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things under conversation that it's really hard to keep up on a daily basis. But there has been discussion of reducing all indirects for all scientific research to 15%. The president's budget, and it's only a starting point, and Congress will have its crack at it, but it reduces NIH funding by 40%, NSF funding by 50%. And there is, in the reconciliation bill in the House, a proposal that universities with more than $500,000 per student be subject to an endowment tax by tiers, the highest tier being 21%. In the Senate, that came out as 8%. But the challenge for the universities that are fortunate enough over centuries to have built up amazing endowments is we spend that money on undergraduate and graduate and professional student aid. We spend it on research. We spend it on supporting the very things that lead to research discovery and the future generations' educations. And if all of that were to happen at once, a university like Yale, that is one of the leaders in NIH and medical research, would become a much smaller place, delivering fewer basic science discoveries and treating fewer patients in clinical trials. We currently have 38,000 patients in clinical trials supported by the NIH. If that funding goes away, that is the last shot for many people for extending their own lives and future discoveries for future generations. It could be really devastating to American higher education and down the road to the opportunities for American companies to be driving economic development going forward.
How do you see it?
We're really experiencing this level of uncertainty at every point in our cycle. And uncertainty is really the word I think many of us would use to describe the environment we're in. And of course, as we all know, the one thing investors hate most is uncertainty. So it really starts, in the earliest stages, all the things that we've been talking about with respect to federal funding and some of the underlying foundational research, but it extends all the way to the opposite side of the process when we're talking about pricing and what companies that develop new medicine are actually able to get paid for the new therapies that they develop. And then, of course, that's not to mention tariffs and then everything in between related to regulatory process, regulatory uncertainty, how these projects actually make their way from discovery through development to being new medicines. So all of these things are coming together to very much impact our space. And just to put it in perspective, I think these are some numbers that may surprise many of you. If you look at the XBI, that's the kind of basic biotechnology index that we use to measure our sector, how that's performed over the last 10 years. I looked this morning, if you basically invested $1 literally 10 years ago in that index and looked at how much it would be worth today, the answer is $1. Wow. 10 years, no return. If you compare that to the S&P 500 over the same period of time, I'll use a more exciting number. Let's say you invested $10,000 in the S&P 500. Today, that's worth over $30,000, a total cumulative return of about 225%. So unbelievable discrepancy in performance in the capital markets, and a lot of that is related to the kind of uncertainty that we're talking about. And also the fact that several years ago, especially during the height of the pandemic, there was a lot of froth in our sector. Many companies went public that shouldn't have gone public. They were preclinical in many instances, much earlier than what we're used to seeing companies do when they access the public markets. And so a lot of that is now coming home to roost. Those companies, in many cases, are well below the values at which they went public. They're having trouble raising additional capital. And the reality is there's going to be a significant amount of consolidation. Now, that arguably is a healthy thing. There should be selectivity in the capital markets, and it should only be those companies, as you were alluding to earlier, David, that are successful developing new medicines that should be rewarded. But there has to be something waiting for them on the other side. As they make progress with their new medicines, will they be rewarded for the progress they've made? And is value creation happening? Because that value creation is really what's necessary for attracting more capital to those companies for them to complete clinical development and ultimately launch new medicines. And I think in many ways it's that last part of the process that's broken. And what I mean specifically is the part where it's basically faith-based. I'm going to give you money. You're going to run a trial. That trial is going to be successful. And then the company is going to be worth more after your successful trial than it was before. And that's the piece that's not happening. And when that's not happening, those companies basically can't raise the money they need for those final stages of clinical development and ultimately commercialization. So a long way of answering your question, but that's how uncertainty is really affecting us at all stages. Last thing I'll say, we are hopeful that over the relatively short period of time, we're starting to get clarity in terms of what the new regulatory environment looks like. We'll learn soon what the new pricing environment looks like, and the ecosystem we're in will adapt, but it is a fragile ecosystem.
Before we open it up, I do have to ask you one question, because I think a lot of people look at your job and say, wow, that's like the hardest job in America right now. Being president of a major university, you've been doing it less than a year. Is it one of the hardest jobs in America? Do you ever get to have any fun? Tell us just a little bit what it's like to be the president of Yale today.
There is no doubt that I have impeccable timing. So yeah, I mean, the uncertainty is
Yes.
unlike anything that education has ever seen, right? I mean, our institution is 324 years old, and it's used to just kind of doing its thing, right? And this year has been one of rather constant daily challenges. That said, do I ever get to have fun? Yes, because much of my job is, of course, interacting with the unbelievable students and faculty and staff on our campus and the alumni in our community. And every day you get reassured by the remarkable young people who are coming to the university for an education. They are filled with ideas and optimism and dreams for the future. And it reminds you that everything's going to be great because there is so much talent and creativity in the young people who come to our university for an education. So yes, there's a lot of fun.
Excellent. Okay, time to hear some questions from you all. I see a question back here. My job is to be the enforcer and make sure the questions are actually questions rather than statements. So have at us.
Thank you. Hi again, Megan. Thank you so much for your thoughts on the panel today. I just wanted to share, I'm a high schooler. I developed a medical device. I'm currently a fourth year at the University of Iowa in a global health program. You mentioned the challenges that faculty face in getting their products or their discoveries from discovery to commercialization. And I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit to kind of your point on your last comments about student innovations and student ideas. What role should universities play in accelerating student-led health innovations, not just a part of coursework, but taking prototypes into viable products just like anyone else? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. And in fact, that is one of the things that our Yale Ventures is very focused on, creating a kind of support ecosystem for really anybody in our community who has an idea that they are hoping to take to market. And we have some remarkable success stories of great companies that have created by students while they're students that have afterward gone on to incredible success. I'm thinking of one in particular formed by an undergraduate and a graduate student at Yale who encountered each other, in the course of their studies. That is a mental health platform that is now a company worth $2 billion. Wow. And it emerged from that kind of student creativity with help and support along the way. So universities are, many of them, creating these kinds of ecosystems to support exactly the kind of creativity you mentioned.
We'll go one here and then two here.
Thank you so much for this panel. I really have been enjoying this conversation, and I really appreciated, close to the end, the acknowledgement of the potential NIH and NSF funding cuts. And you've been talking about really this three-legged stool of government, universities, private sector. What happens when potentially that one leg of that stool becomes much smaller? How can this system evolve and shift given what might be in front of us?
Yeah. I'll start, but then I'm going to ask Brett to jump in, because when I meet with lawmakers, and I spend a lot of time in DC meeting with lawmakers, you quite often hear, well, more R&D is shifting to companies, and companies can just fill the gap. And my response to that is always to lean on the stories of discoveries that have required, some of which I share here today, that have required those decades of funding research that you don't know where it is going to go. And so I don't know what the creativity is that, if $20 billion is pulled out of the NIH budget, backfills that $20 billion, because in my conversations with leaders in industry, and in philanthropy, which is the other place where people will often say can fill the hole, it's too deep a hole, is what I am constantly told. But I'd love to hear your perspective on it.
Absolutely. I think the most important thing I think we need to do now is everything we can to not let that happen. Because, as you said, the gap is far too wide. And hopefully I've painted some picture of the pressures that the private sector are under across all parts of the spectrum, as we said. And it's interesting, in many cases, that we've got kind of some of the same entities that are defending the NIH funding and federal funding as they should, that are talking about, well, we need to, put a lot of pressure on drug pricing in this country because, drugs are unaffordable. But those are really both parts of the same fragile ecosystem that I was describing earlier. So it is hard at the same time to seek significantly lower pricing for drugs that we know are delivering value to the system and ask those entities that are under pressure to fill in the giant multi-dozen billion-dollar gap that we're talking about. So I think recognizing that interdependency as we're looking for solutions is important. But again, I think the most important thing, unfortunately, is do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. Because if it does, we will be making choices that none of us really want to be making.
And so just as a very practical thing to all of you in the audience, and to all of your friends and family members that you can encourage to do so, the budget will be debated over the course of the fall. And so reaching out to your congressional representatives and telling them how important funding for science is can play a really, really big role. So I encourage all of you to do so.
We started by talking about stories and the importance of stories, that even much more so than statistics are how people learn and think about things. And when you think about the great industries that we have in this country, I'm not saying that absolutely none of them started without major government investment in basic research, but I can't off the top of my head think of any major industry that didn't. Aviation, the big three in Detroit, obviously pharmaceuticals, Silicon Valley, one after another. Fracking, one after another. You had really important government investment that made possible it later on, and I think that's part of the case. We had 2 questions on the aisle here, and let's do both of them in whatever order you all want.
Hello, I'm Marion Nessel, New York University. I'm trained in basic science, but over the years came to understand that health is the result of a lot of factors in society, the famous social and behavioral causes of health. What's happening with the humanities and social sciences? Are we going to save them in this moment of crisis?
Thank you very much for that. At a university that has long prided itself on incredible strengths across the arts, humanities, and social sciences, you can imagine that this is something we worry about very much. You hear lots of rhetoric and discussion about how we need to push more of our students into getting science-based, technology-based degrees. And I worry that if we have an education that is only focused on technology and on science, we will stop asking the questions of what role is science playing in our society? How do we shape technologies going forward to ensure that they are actually good for society? So we work really hard at Yale University to make sure that our students are getting this very broad liberal arts-based education, and even in their graduate and professional programs, that they are taking courses outside of their fields of study in order to bring that more well-rounded approach to the work that we are doing in science and technology. It is another area that needs broad advocacy to make sure that those are programs that remain strong, and as that we develop AI, that we make sure that we develop an AI that is good for our society, not one that destroys it.
And you walk the walk. You are an art historian.
I am an art historian. Probably the only one on Aspen Health stage.
My question is, how do we keep, maintain, and actually improve this beautiful ecosystem when there's some disruptions that are on the horizon, and actually here in particular on the university side, on the learning side, the world has changed, and the students are expecting different ways of learning that are personalized, that are online, can be done much less costly, and it seems like there's some serious disruption in the works, competency-based education. So how do we do that? Reduce the costs, improve the education, reduce the time without losing this ecosystem?
Great question. Do you have the answer? Yeah, I mean, as you pointed out, there are disruptions in so many ways, and I do think that a piece of it goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, and that is coming up with our systems approach to all of this, where we're really thinking and working in collaboration. You know, this ecosystem has survived for a long time, but in many ways, we each kind of do our thing, right? You know, universities are pursuing their research, and you all are, you know, pursuing the goals of your companies. We're not always working as deeply in collaboration as we probably need to be doing so going forward. So I do think that this time of disruption has the potential. I think out of disruption, we need to find our opportunities. And I think our opportunities are figuring out how we work collaboratively together in new ways that will actually achieve some of what you were hoping for.
And there's obviously a ton of disruption going on. I don't want to suggest otherwise. But I also think COVID taught us that some things may be disrupted less than we thought, and that actually online learning is a very poor substitute for in-person learning, both at Yale and at our K-12 system, and that there are aspects of the old system that we want to keep and improve rather than throwing out.
I think what we learned is some things worked really well. For example, mental health is a great space to talk about a place where the ability to meet with your provider online for so many communities has meant the difference between skipped appointments or an unwillingness to engage. And some people, for whatever reason, just like those interactions better, and it's worked fabulously well, right? There are other things, like going to see your orthopedic surgeon, that probably isn't going to work very well online. And education's been the same way. There are some pieces of it where online has worked incredibly well for our students. Something like Khan Academy has helped so many students in tutoring and math and other areas. But they still crave and learn better, and often desire, especially at the undergraduate stage, to be in conversation with one another, to learn how to test their ideas through direct interaction, both with their peers and with a faculty member. But there are other graduate sorts of programs that have worked fabulously well in an online space that allow us to reduce costs. So it really is being very particular about how we apply it.
That makes sense. Okay, we've got time for one more question.
Hi, thank you very much for joining us. As a father of a middle school girl who has anxiety about her academic future, it feels like getting into an elite university is going to be really hard, just looking at the data, right? It seems like universities want to keep their enrollment smaller, right? They want to advertise, we only accept X percentage, and it's going to be really tiny. So unless you do everything exactly right, you're probably not coming to an elite university. Can you talk about how you balance that? And do you think elite universities need to actually expand supply to give more opportunity to more students?
You have named one of the reasons why American higher education has lost trust over the last decade. The first is cost, the second is access, and the third is around a variety of issues around cancel culture or viewpoint diversity. The access question is a serious one. You know, it depends how you define elite. As somebody who has spent her career at multiple public flagship universities, I can tell you there are so many great places in America where you can receive an amazing education, and there has been a tendency, particularly, no offense, in the press, to fixate on a small number of institutions and to create in our students the sense that their futures are not possible if they don't go to these schools. That simply isn't true. I also think that universities like Yale have done a lot of evolution in the last decade in switching the mindset around our size. So Yale has grown almost 20% in the last decade, but we cannot easily keep up with America's population growth. So if you go back to, where Yale was when I went to college, and where the US population was, the population has grown by 35%. Yale's only grown 20%, right? So, and we just can't keep up with that pace. We're out of land in New Haven. We have a residential college model. We have no space. We could build new residential colleges. We added 2 in the last decade. We announced another 100 growth, but we're never going to keep up with that demand. I think reframing a sense of one's future and the many hundreds of institutions in America where you can receive an amazing undergraduate education and experience that sets you up for a great future. I'm the product of a public university. My undergraduate degree is from a public university, and I feel like I had a lot of opportunity in life. So I do think that we can reframe that a little bit, and I really hope for your middle school daughter that you can help her know that her future will be bright, and it's not about getting into a small handful of schools.
That is the perfect note on which to end it. Thank you both very much. Thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of the festival.